came in a whole different package. It was a much smaller film with a whole cast of young people, young producers, young money people, very, very young, out of New York. Very ambitious, hadn't really done anything themselves. This was going to be a first shot. The writer, David Ward, was attached to it because it was his first, no, I think his second work. And they all had a kind of collective, and they wanted to support each other, which I totally respected. And they wanted him to direct it. And so when they sent it to me because we all kind of knew each other. And would I support him directing it and so forth? And I read it. And when I read it, I thought, okay, I don't know, I guess, maybe. You know, I tried hard to see myself in it, really. It seemed fun. It seemed different and kind of quirky. But because of its structure, I thought it would take a real master director to pull it off. And I didn't want to insult or not support a newcomer, but I said, I'm sorry, I think for me to be in this, it would have to be in the hands of a more experienced director. So if you want to do it with David, which I totally support, then why don't you go and see if you can put it together. So they had another cast in mind, they had other people involved. Next thing I knew, George called me and he said, look, I just read this script. I think it's fabulous. I said, you do? He said, yeah. And they told me why. He was obviously very taken with it. That's the first good sign when the director has a vision, that you're going to be very drawn to that.
When they did Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, George Roy Hill rented a house from Paul in Beverly Hills. Now, when he came out to do The Sting, he called Newman on the phone and he said, is that house by any chance available at the moment for rent? And Newman said, yeah, as a matter of fact. You want to rent it? And Hill said, yeah. And Newman said, well, what do you do? What are you doing out here? George Roy Hill said, I'm making a picture with Redford. And Newman said, oh, anything in it for me? Now, George Roy Hill told me this story. There came a pause, and George Roy Hill saw the dollar signs turning in his head. And he answered, yes, there's a part. But I got to tell you now, it's the second part. And Newman said, send me a script.
George sent me the script. And I said, George, I think the script is wonderful. In fact, it's near perfect, but I am dead wrong for that part. And he said, why? I said, it seems very clear to me. This is the king handing the scepter to the prince.
Gondorff was a big man. Big, heavy-set guy with lots of weight.
Memory, and you can corroborate that with Redford. But Joanne and I were living in a tiny little apartment on East 50th Street, and they came up to talk to me about doing this. And we lived on the 4th floor. They punched the button, and the elevator went past the 4th floor, up to some other floor. And during that time waiting for the elevator, the silence was absolutely deafening. And then George said, I think you're if you don't do this film. And I said, in that case, what can I say? And then the elevator came back down again. And I always keep thinking, what if the guy hadn't rung it on the 12th floor? And they'd come up the 4th floor and nobody had insulted me like that.
Paul has no mind. He has a very poor mind. So I don't know what Paul remembered, but I suspect at some time we were in an elevator, but I don't know that I can remember what happened in an elevator. I do know that George wanted him in the movie, so I really can't comment on it. I think maybe Paul and George might have been in an elevator. I don't remember an elevator, but then I'm losing my mind too.
He had you down as a big timer.
Perfect script, because first of all, it was extremely unique. It was touching a territory that had never even been close to being touched before. But you can't underestimate George. He's such a craftsman. He's had such experience with script. And because of his own life experience, coming from a publishing family, being interested in comic strips when he was a kid, he found great value in comic strips, the Sunday comics, because he believed that the 4-panel sequencing, where you had to tell a story in 4, at the most 5 panels, have a beginning, middle, end, and complete it, was a very powerful guide, and he kind of followed that. He told me that story once, which I thought was amazing.
I don't remember a more perfect script. Now, I know George had worked with David Ward on it for some time. I don't know to the extent that it had been changed, but I don't think we changed 4 words in that script the entire time we shot it.
It's a really just about a perfect piece of work in terms of screen craftsmanship.
Are you walking out of the scene? I said, I'm getting a tray of ice cubes. He said, what for? He says, well, if you've been out on a night like that, I mean, man, you got to find somewhere to wake up.
Paul and I come from the same seed in terms of how we came into the business. We came through theater in New York. So craft is important, therefore we approach our roles in very much the same way, seriously crafting the character and being in character, playing the character, despite whatever of your own self is going to show up, you're playing a character. So we take that seriously, so we're committed to delivering the characters to the story and not going off track like you're a personality or a celebrity where you feel you're being hired as a personality, so you give them personality no matter what the script of the story is doing. That's not who we are. On the other hand, your own whatever is there. So I think that is what, you know, what the relationship that Paul and I have in real life is going to show up somehow on the screen, even though our characters are different. I was a much younger guy than he was. He was kind of washed up. I was just a brash kid that didn't have any experience. He was my mentor.
And when they weren't shooting a scene, either one of them or both of them were out there polishing that thing with a rag. I think one time he found the key, got the keys to Redford's Porsche, and went out and took it and hid it. And I think Redford said, I knew one day somebody was going to steal my car.
I go out and I do this sting. Meeting Paul Newman was, wow, you know. We did the scene together and I said, Paul Newman, I thought there was going to be something. You know, there's nothing. I tore him up. Well, when it came out on the screen, you couldn't get your eyes off Paul Newman, and I'm trying to look at myself, and I can't. He was incredible.
Either while he was thinking, or if he had a problem, or whatever, he would be doing this. And I thought, One day during the rehearsal, I was sitting in a chair next to him, and the stage door opened, and Robert Shaw came limping in, walked over, and he said, right away, he said, look, no money involved. I'm very sorry. This is all my fault. I was playing handball, and I've sprained my ankle it's very bad. And you put another actor in, it's okay with me, you know, and no money involved. And George Roy Hill went, he said, walk over there. And Robert Shaw limped over. He said, now come back. And I looked at him with, yeah. George Roy Hill said, what are you doing? I didn't know how to answer it. He said, don't do that kind of stuff. I was almost tempted to say, you don't know what's good and you don't know what's bad. What the hell's the matter with you? But you don't talk to George Roy Hill like that.
George Roy Hill was kind of a taskmaster, and I came up with some ideas, and he said, I hate New York actors. They're always thinking. And he'd say, no, that's not, no. But what is that? Will you stop that? So, but I was always like, what if it's not about you, Durning, it's about them.
George was probably a little more autocratic because of his military. He certainly didn't tolerate any uppity behavior. He knew when to leave you alone, when to let you have your head, when to let you peek out something and then to take it down. You start out with a bad idea, and he was perfectly willing to see where it goes. My feeling about that is a lot of times you do something on the set that is outrageous and absolutely inappropriate. But out of that comes the 180-degree idea that really works, that you never would have thought about unless you'd made a jerk out of yourself to begin with.
Elderly man called Whitey. He looked like your grandfather. I mean, he was wonderful. And George introduced him to me, and he said, now, Dimitri's a little concerned, Whitey, about, the possibility of, of getting hit in the eye or something like that. He says, don't worry, honey. He says, I hardly ever miss. And of course, I started laughing. It was like he had a blowgun, and it's like this pellet came at me and hit me in the forehead. George showed me the lens. He wanted me to appreciate this is the biggest close-up. It doesn't get any bigger than this. And then he said, no, we've got to do it again. And I said, why? He said, you blinked. I said, well, of course. I said, that's only human. He said, I know. I don't want it. A director who would sit and think of every detail that he didn't want me to blink.
Next thing you know, I'm driving around and I hear number 4 this week, The Sting with Marvin Hamlish, and I was going like, you gotta be kidding.
There aren't too many directors like George Roy Hill. I've never worked with anybody who was as good as he. Never. He knew what he wanted. He knew how to talk to actors. He knew how to be firm, but right on the money.
I picked up a lot of things from George that have been useful to me, mostly. His sense of preparation, his sense of really wanting to understand every element of the script so that he can be as articulate and thorough with the actors as possible. I hope that some of George's love of just making movies has worn off on me. I mean, he loved to do it. It was work, yeah, it was like it is for everybody. It's very intense, strenuous kind of thing to do. There's a lot of tension, but he loved doing it. He loved telling stories. George sees himself as a storyteller. He's not the kind of guy who feels like he's got to put his indelible stamp on everything. His philosophy was, my job is to tell this story in the best way I can, to make this story live, to make all of the things it's trying to do felt. You don't see that so much anymore. A lot of directors now, they want to be bigger than the material.
George always defied being typed. His work always had a very clear mark on it, and I didn't see The Sting when it came out. I was in Europe making The Great Gatsby.
I know it doesn't sound like a big deal, but it is. And I can say that now, having gone through many experiences that were not as loving and as rich as that. I just was enjoying it, which was lovely.
People were courteous. I mean, nobody was rude, and when you think of the way crews are today, of course, it's a different generation, it's a different thing, but I mean, it kind of hurts because they don't know what it was like then because they're all so much younger. But it was pretty wonderful.
It used to be fun and there was a lot of camaraderie, and now I don't know, it's as though it's too expensive to be funny, it's too expensive to have fun, it's too expensive to really enjoy what you're doing because every minute costs $16,000 and tomorrow it's going to cost $18,000. And it's so expensive that people aren't certain of their own judgment anymore, and they're not certain of their own taste, and they're not certain of their own convictions. So they then have to put out cards to the audience, and the audience then makes the changes. I can't remember that happening when we started making films. We made some pretty bad films, but I can't remember anybody ever. The director cut the film was advertised, the film went into theaters. They didn't get focus groups or rump groups or rump focus groups or cards or did we like this guy or did we like, I don't know. But by and large, it's done by committee now.
Well, I assume George Roy Hill couldn't make a film in that environment.
George Roy Hill would have their heads.
George had something that is very rare. He had the courage of his convictions. When he made a decision, that was it. When he wanted to cast me, it didn't matter to him that Universal didn't want me. He fought for me. No, that was it. It's so rare today that you meet that kind of a person. So rare. And I mean, he had a life other than being a director, too. I mean, this was a really Renaissance man. The man was wonderful, but he had courage. He trusted his instincts. He trusted himself. He trusted his choices. It was wonderful. It's great. Because it inspires confidence from every actor, and I would imagine the crew, too. You know you're in the hands of a master. It's a good feeling.
He scared the hell out. I mean, people, you'd see guys with powerful positions in the studio, they would quake if they knew that they were having a meeting with him.
There was a liveliness about him, and yet a grandness and a elegance about him. There was an elegance about him.
He was a good guy. I really liked him.
I think it was melancholy all the way through. I think the music is melancholy. And I think when you stop to think of where Mr. Hill is now, it's all melancholy. And I miss him, and I wish he was still working.
I am not sure that George has received the attention that he deserves because he was rebellious and perverse and kind of went against the grain a lot of the time. He did these really odd, quirky pieces, and most of them he did a great job with. So I hope that one day he gets the credit he deserves as a filmmaker.
George stuck his head in my office and said, D.D. Allen, who was the editor, he said was coming by for a drink at 4 o'clock, and would I like to come and have a beer in his office? I said, sure. So then about 3:45, he said, I have no beer and I have no vodka. Could you bring some with you? I said, sure. So we went over and we had a beer, and he had a vodka, and I sent him a bill for $8. And he then wrote me a 3-page letter on friendship, at which time I went in and sawed his desk in half and said, this is not about friendship, this is about $8. And I said I may detonate the entire bungalow next time, so I wouldn't mess around. So, God, then I got a bill about 4 months later from Universal Studios saying that I owed him $800. So then I had my lawyer write a letter that said that I had, in fact, if I owed him $800, then I owed it, and they were charged at me, that was from the date of the offense. But what they didn't realize, that I was renting the desk back to George, since he had nailed it together with some 1x3s, and everybody that would come in would see this battered thing that would cross like a kid with an orange crate. And I said, so I've really owned the desk for 6 weeks, and I've been renting it back to George at $400 a week, so you owe me $800 or whatever it was. And it was, I don't know. I'm not sure that the industry can handle that kind of frivolity anymore. I don't think it happens.